Welcome back to another Sika Q&A. This is a weightlifting specific question. Joshua Chen sent it in and he says, with weightlifting, is it better to think of correcting one thing, so think of one cue at a time, or try to lift to correct all your technical deficiencies?
So the answer is you should always be trying to lift with perfect technique and do everything right. But in reality, you should be looking to correct, probably look at the chain of events and see what the issue is. So if, for example, you have terrible mobility and you have a lot of trouble getting underneath the barbell, the most efficient thing to do there wouldn't be to go try and improve your overhead stability, do lots of snatch balances, for example. It wouldn't be trying to do loads of complexes of that, loads of full snatches, and try and kind of hit it with a 12 gauge and try cover everything as much as possible. Is really inefficient. The smarter thing to do would be first fix your mobility as much as possible, address that and get it as good as you possibly can. So like treat that as your main training goal. So just an example. Now there could be lots of other things, but the reason you treat the mobility first and not focus on trying to improve the stability and overhead work first is because once you adjust your mobility, you will end up with a vastly different lift if you improve your mobility. So if your mobility is sufficiently bad, by the time you've changed that mobility, you'll essentially have a different body. Their movements will be so different. If you've an extra 6 inches of overhead squat depth to carry through with, you'll have a massively different lift. So even if the amount of stability lift or stability work you would have done prior to your mobility improvement, you'd still end up with more stability work to do after. So it wouldn't be the most efficient training, and you'd end up just kind of shooting yourself in the foot, and you'd end up having to do all of that stability stuff again. So I would say look at the sequence of events and see what the issue is, and then correct those one at a time. So it could be mobility, it could be your first pull is terrible, it could be your start position is very bad, it could be a whole host of things. So the most important thing you need to do is look at first is what is the most important thing that needs to be corrected, and then work at that at one time. Like for example, we might do a case file on him or a case study. I've a master's lifter, very good at power snatching and power cleaning his movements, but had a very, very poor overhead. He is talented genetically as an athlete. He's just, even though he's a master's lifter, he's in his 40s, he is still very, very talented. He's done a lot of track and field. So he didn't really have issues with trying to get better at weightlifting as such. It was his technique and his overhead that we needed to work on. So before we worked on his pull, for example, we just spent a lot of time, a lot of weeks just doing lots of overhead overhead snatch, grip, push press, and overhead squats, snatch balances, snatch plus snatch, grip, overhead squats, and snatch balance. Literally any combination of overhead work you can think of. We just spent months doing that. In the meantime, his overhead or his full snatch caught up with his full lift. And now at this point, we've sufficiently improved his overhead stability and his mobility that his pull now looks a lot worse than it previously did, because both of those were in a bad position. But again, we just need to focus in on his actual pull of the lift, for example. So his overhead is great. He can support a lot more than his full snatch now. He can full snatch his previous power snatch. So we just need to kind of shift the crosshairs every so often. So now that there was nothing actually bad about his pull now, it's just that his overhead has improved so much, we don't need to focus on that anymore. We can kind of put that in the back burner, and now we're going to shift to things like he makes a lot of hip contact, he kind of smashes the bar away, so we're focusing on stuff like high pulls, so to direct the barbell upwards, and we're doing stuff like no contact snatches, and we can kind of maintain his overhead very, very easily for the next couple of months by doing just say 20% of the overhead work that we've put into his overhead stuff that we were previously doing. And then once we fix his pull, I'm sure something else will crop up. It might be his squat won't be strong enough. So we just pick things that make the most sense, focus on those things, and just be very, very efficient with them, rather than being like, this is all shit and I need to fix everything.
I think the nature of weightlifting is just a constant thing of fighting fires. So as Garth said, like once one thing gets fixed, something else will pop up. A good place to start though is think firstly about positions. So Garth talked earlier about like mobility being really restrictive and you have to work on mobility first. So if you can't get into the start position for the snatch, get into the power position for the snatch, and then get into the overhead squat position, the last thing you need to think about is actually doing a snatch. You need to hit the positions first. The second thing then would be like, are you able to move from position to position fairly freely with a good motor pattern? So if somebody's extremely restricted, say through the hamstrings or through a certain level of ankle mobility, if they set up for their snatch, they can get into the setup position, and then as they go through their first pull, their knees come back and they're in that kind of fully hinged at the hip position, but they can't have their knees all the way back and their shoulders in front of the bar. They'll then need to get some length into their hamstrings and open up that range of motion. So firstly is position. Can you hit the position itself? Secondly, can you move from position to position? And thirdly, can you move from position to position with extreme amounts of force and power and speed? So I think that's a good way of like you prioritizing things and clicking things off on that list and like figuring out which fire to run to first. The second thing I'd say then is that a lot of the time things at the start of the lift, so in our setup, in our first pull, in our second pull, obviously they influence things later on in the lift an awful lot more. So if you have an athlete who's missing, or you are an athlete who's missing a lot of weights out in front, right? You might immediately think, okay, it's my overhead position isn't strong enough, my shoulders aren't strong enough, whatever that might be. I might need a bigger overhead squat, right? But that issue could be coming from the bar being 4 inches away from you as it passes your knees, or your knees being too far out in front as you're going through that knee passage phase, or you could be rolling the bar away from you as you're setting up and just going into your dynamic start. So if you've gone through position, being able to move through position, and then being able to move from position to position quickly, you've gone through those 3 steps and can't figure out where to start. Next thing is start with the setup. Start with the setup, start with the first pull, then go to the second pull, then go to the contact, then go to the third pull, then go to the overhead position. Because it's very, very likely that if we keep trying to fix something that's happening at the hip, and then we fix that, and then we go and fix the thing that's happening in the first pull, that kind of sequence of events will have kicked itself off again. And like the term Owen used, where basically you're in a different body or you're a different athlete, will come into the case again. It will be like getting more mobility in your ankles and trying to do the same squat. The squat will look drastically different from how it looked before. We have a squat masterclass coming up. So the first one is booked out. The second one is pretty much booked out, even though we don't have the date released yet. It will be a Saturday in the next coming weeks, probably Saturday the 5th. If you're interested in this, pop us an email, seekerstrength@gmail.com. We'll pop a link below in the description for this video. As always, if you've more questions, pop them down below, or if you've more to add on this topic, pop them down in the questions below and we'll chat to you there. Thank you.